This is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher and website designer in Wilmington, Delaware. And we're doing a series of short podcasts. This is the third in the series. The general theme is gravity, support, and freedom. We've done two podcasts about gravity, and we're going to do one now about support. And for all of these podcasts, Imogen is interviewing me. So, Imogen, I'm handing it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Robert. Very interesting so far. So let's just start back at the beginning. And why don't you tell us what is the Alexander Technique?
Well, I think the most relevant description or definition for these podcasts is it's a method of learning how to do whatever activities you do in accordance with your structure, your physical structure, and with the forces operating on you, so that you sit, stand, and move using yourself in the way nature intended you to do so.
So, great. And so, as we're sort of defining terms, what is support, or what do you mean by support in this context?
Well, let me just back up a second because
Sure.
I alluded to forces operating on
Uh-huh.
you. And the previous two podcasts were all about gravity, which is a force that operates on us all the time. Um, this podcast is about a second force that operates on us, and I'm calling it support, and I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that. But in very general terms, it's the force that keeps us from actually being in the center of the earth, where gravity is tending to which gravity is tending to draw us.
Mm.
Gravity pulls us straight down to the center of the earth, but if you look around, you notice you're not there. And the question is, why not? And what is it that keeps us from all being there?
Right.
And that's what I'm going to define as support.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So, what are the implications of this support?
Well, I want to say exactly what it is,
Okay, go ahead.
which is um, any surface that let's just talk about standing primarily, but everything I'm saying applies in its own way to sitting as well, or lying down. But if we talk about standing, when you're standing somewhere on a floor or even the pavement or the earth, the pressure of your foot or feet on that surface, which indirectly comes about from the gravitational pull on your center of gravity, that pressure creates a little distortion in the surface of in the surface you're standing on. You could think of it as a little dent that you're creating. Now, if you're standing on a concrete pavement, obviously that dent is very small, but it is not non-existent. You're putting weight down on the concrete causes a little disruption in the surface of the concrete.
So, if we're standing on something visibly softer,
Hmm.
like I
Let's
don't know, grass
grass
or
or
earth,
a
we
mossy
might actually
surface.
notice that
Yeah,
dent. Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Or a sandy soil, something where there is more give. When you can sense that dent a lot more. Um,
But yet
even
you still don't go all the way
You're
through
not going to
it.
go all the way to the center of the earth, because somewhere between you and the center and a lot closer to you is going to be some very hard material that's not going to let you go any further. And I want to talk about what that means exactly.
Okay.
The term hard, which we use to describe objects, it's also a bit of a technical term, or hardness is a technical term. I think most people know that diamonds, for example, rate very high on a hardness scale. And one of their industrial uses is cutting other hard objects because they are harder. And steel, of course, is pretty hard, and so it's used to cut things that are less hard, like wood, and so on. And hardness is actually a bit of physics terminology, which, even though I was in a previous incarnation a physics major and actually worked in the field for a very short period of time, I was not familiar with any of this because it's not sort of commonly taught in general physics classes. But hardness is the ability of a material to resist deforming. So concrete is a lot harder than wood because it resists a lot, but it doesn't resist completely. That's what I want to get across.
And I guess all material has this to
Every
a lesser
pretty
or
much
greater.
every material has it. And so when you're standing on the floor, for example, and there's weight coming down through your feet onto the floor, you're creating a little indentation in the floor. It's certainly not likely to be visible, but the floor's reaction to that is to try to restore its original shape. That's what hardness is. And the forces that in the previous podcast, I think the first one, we talked about the different forces in nature, gravity being a very weak one compared to some of the others. But the strong force as we mentioned, is that it's responsible for holding the nuclei of atoms together, and it kind of wants to keep things the way they are.
So is that the force we're actually dealing with when
I believe so.
Okay.
Technically I can't, but it's a very powerful but very localized force. It's just where you happen to be standing. That distortion wants to correct itself. So if you could imagine your weight creating a little dent in the surface, and that dent wants to
sort of almost pushing back.
repair itself. If it were able to repair itself fully, it would be it pushes up against you, basically. And that and the amount of force of that upward push is exactly equal to and in an opposite direction of the downward gravitational force. So if you're a heavy person and you make a larger dent, you're going to get a bigger upward force because there's a bigger downward force on your center of gravity towards the center of the Earth.
Okay.
And if it's just a very light object, like a piece of paper that lands on the floor, well, there's the tiniest of effect either way.
Okay.
So, and this is quite important. I used to tell my students, I've always been interested in having them notice the effects of directions on how their feet contact the floor, because it's something they can often sense pretty well, and they can also hear the sound of their shoes or feet coming down on the ground. So it's a nice, easy thing for them to notice. And typically, if we're using walking as a teaching framework, and they use an Alexander direction, they may notice that their feet don't come down as heavily, and that there's less noise from their feet. And I used to say to them, well, the deal here is that the floor doesn't really care about you. It's not going to give way at all. So that's where your extra downward pull comes to an end. And I realize now that's not exactly accurate. The floor does care in its own way, but it's still true that the Alexander directions, if properly deployed, are going to mean that you're only going to be transferring your weight, say from foot to foot as you walk. You're not also going to be adding a pushing into the ground.
So that is sort of what I wanted to ask, that I think you've indirectly alluded to there, is that what interferes with this support,
Right.
for
Well,
being as supportive as it can be?
right. And before answering that, I just want to reiterate that force is applied to the soles of your feet, basically. Now, if you're sitting in a chair and you're actually using your sits bones, that force is applied to your sits bones. And if you're lying down, it's being applied pretty much to your whole body. It's much more spread out.
So
But
if I was standing on my head,
it would be applied to the point on your head that was in contact with
so
the
whatever
ground.
is in contact with the surface beneath.
And even if you're sitting at a desk and you rest your hand on the surface of the desk, if you just rest it there and let the desk take that weight, it's that the downward force is gravity that from your hand and probably part of your arm that's going towards the center of the earth, and the little upward force from the surface of the desk. So what interferes with it is basically excess tension. And by that I mean that, let's say you have a habit of overly tightening your legs when standing or walking. A not uncommon situation. Or, overly tensing your legs or tending to hold your legs in some way that isn't like perhaps in walking, turning your legs out a lot with each step. You know what I mean by that? Knees going out. Anything that sort of distorts the movement of your legs is of course distorting your overall movement, but it's also interfering with the support, because the support's still there at your feet, but part of your leg's job is to convey that up through them to the rest of you. And if your legs are busy doing other things, like creating excess tension, they interfere with that upward
So you're not
flow.
getting the full
effect.
You're still getting quite a lot of it, obviously, but you're not getting the full benefit.
You're getting it, but you're not getting it in a nice, clean way. You're getting it in a distorted way, is how I would put it. And perhaps even more important, that anything that creates excess tension in your feet, your leg, and your legs, makes it much more difficult for you to actually sense the surface that you're on. And so you're not able to respond as effectively to that upward force. So it kind of interferes with, if you take an object and put it on the floor, there's nothing to interfere with anything. The object's just there, it's pulled down by gravity, and it's pushed up by the floor, and that's the end of the story. But with a living being, we have ways of kind of messing that up a bit.
So my guess is this is where Alexander technique might come in.
I think so. And in fact, just a little historical note. I believe it's in Use of the Self, Alexander's third book, but I'm not 100% sure. You might know. And when Alexander describes his initial experiments that basically led to the technique, he was a reciter and trying to get his voice out to the back of auditoriums where there was no PA system. The big thing everyone knows about is he set up mirrors to observe what he did with his head, neck, and upper torso. But there is a mention in there somewhere that he noticed in the course of these experiments that as an actor and reciter, he had been trained to, I think he puts it, try to grab the floor with his feet.
Yeah, no, I remember that.
Yeah,
yes.
and of course, if you think about it, it's not really something you can do, but you could try to do it and create a lot of excess tension in your feet. So I think that was probably part of his issue as well. He doesn't go on to talk a lot about it, but I would be shocked if that habit didn't dissipate itself in the course of his own development of the use of himself.
I'm sure it did dissipate.
But it's a perfect example. I mean, that's one of the easiest ways that if you want to run a little experiment, if you want to sense what it's like to interfere with support, tighten your feet. Try to grab the floor with your feet and just notice how that affects your balance, your stability, and so on. And you'll see that it could have quite an effect on not just your feet, but everything above.
Yeah, interesting. So how does the Alexander technique help or address this?
I'd like to get into that more in the next podcast. I mean, in general,
Right.
But in general terms, the Alexander technique is one way to describe the Alexander technique, a little different from the original one I gave you, was the Alexander technique is a way of releasing harmful tension from your body. That was Marge Barstow's favorite one. Yeah. And or more precisely, it's a way of learning how to release harmful tension from your body. And certainly, if there is harmful tension in your feet and legs that's interfering with your support and your sensing of that support, the Alexander technique would apply to that just as it might to neck tension or shoulder tension or whatever. So
Absolutely.
I mean, generally, the Alexander technique is known as a very good method of identifying and releasing harmful patterns of posture and movement, if you want to use those terms. And so the big issue is, and we'll talk about it in the next podcast, which will be about freedom. The big issue is this support that I've been talking about comes from the ground near us and acts on us at the soles of our feet. Whereas the center of gravity, our gravity operates on our center of gravity, which is, we mentioned, is a couple of inches below your navel, front to back, side to side, assuming you're standing. So you have this pair of forces that are exactly equal and opposite. One is applied to your feet, and the other is applied to this sort of infinitesimal point somewhere in the middle of you, 2 inches below your navel. And managing those two forces, using them effectively, let's say, I think is a fundamental challenge to human beings.
Yeah, but it sounds like what you're saying is the Alexander technique, a way of describing it would be to help you make the most of those two forces. Or
I think so. And
Yeah.
and we talked earlier about gravity's effect on our heads, that sort of secondary gravitational aspect, and that's very much linked in with the kind of early or classic Alexander direction. Let your neck be free so that your head can go forward and up. That forward of the forward and up is a little rotation of your head in response to gravity pulling it straight down. So it's built into early Alexander ideas, but I don't think it's been applied a lot to these two forces and their interaction to our overall, well, to the support force to our soles of our feet, or as I'm saying, said when you're sitting, to your sits bones or whatever, and the fact that gravity is tending to pull your center right down. So it's operating on a different, in a different way on you than support. So the two forces are opposite, but they don't apply, they don't influence you in exactly the same place. And between those two places are your legs and feet, basically. I mean, your legs, it depends on how you want to define them, but certainly the musculature of your legs comes up to that region where your center of gravity is.
Right. Interesting. Well, Robert, I'm very much looking forward to the next installment.
Well,
Is that everything you wanted to
I
say?
think it is. I think it is, and we can move on to the Freedom podcast.
Great.
So, shall I close out the podcast?
Please do.
Yes, okay. So my guest and interviewer today has been Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher and website designer in Wilmington, Delaware. Once again, Imogen, thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, thank you. Very interesting.